Бочка. Вираж. Вираж идет с перегрузкой 9 единиц. Время виража 13 секунд. Это примерно на секунду лучше, чем у всех современных истребителей.
Welcome to Beer Thunder. I am Squishface, and this is the great big, very messy Su-27 flight model video. This is one of those videos that I started on probably 2 years ago and have constantly put off and just have not wanted to do, and you will see very shortly why that is. Now, this is going to be a little bit different than the MiG-29 video, as I'm not going to share the whole entirety of the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, because it's like 24 pages of disjointed notes and nonsense in a way that's just, it's incomprehensible. Like, I got to go back and just completely redo it and really start this thing from scratch. But the reason that I mention this is because the Su-27 this past Christmas, just fairly recently, had a pretty big flight model overhaul. And the latest post on my YouTube channel was talking a little bit about the first iteration of that overhaul. And the first iteration of that overhaul was completely unfinished. What Gaijin had did to the Su-27 is they had changed the lift coefficient to be a little bit higher to make it meet some performance metrics that are in the flight manual. And in doing so, they ended up buffing the low-speed turn rate as well as the high-speed turn rate. And that initial buff had this really weird portion on the turn rate curve at the very end where its turn rate performance was even more bonkers than it currently is. Now, why have I put off doing this video for so long? Well, first off, Russian is not my first language. So going through Russian sources, getting people to translate them for me, making sure I have a general understanding of what is going on has been rather difficult. And on multiple occasions, I have went down a rabbit hole and have had to correct myself or be corrected to kind of figure out exactly what is going on, because Russian aviation conventions are not exactly to the same standard as NATO conventions, and this is very specific to the Su-27. A perfect example of this, by the way, is all of the original sustained turn rate reports that use the picture from the Su-27 manual, that they look at the caption and they go, aha, it says 50% fuel. And they go to the game, they load up 50% fuel, and they try to duplicate the turn rate numbers, and the turn rate numbers don't match. Because the Su-27 at 50% fuel is actually 50% of normal fuel, which is actually 50%, because the Su-27, if you actually read the manual and kind of go in depth into it, it has normal fuel and it has overload fuel. Overload fuel is 100%, normal fuel is 50%. And that means that in order to conduct turn rate tests with it, you have to load the plane up to 25%. And I've made this mistake in the past where I was one of the guys that went, aha, it says 50%. We're going to go with that. La-di-da. Doesn't match. Report it. Gaijin comes back and goes, actually, you didn't read. Our reference weight is 18,900 kilograms, even though the manual says the reference weight is 20,000 kilograms, because Gaijin, in their research, in their modeling, have also done some rather silly things, like modeling the plane based on calculations for the T-10 prototype as opposed to the Su-27, which, to deconflict that means I do have to go into a little kind of condensed version of Su-27 history. Now, this is not going to be a very long history lecture. I don't remember the names. I'm not taking notes. I'm not pulling up the notes about the designer of, oh yeah, this guy designed it and this guy like died and another guy took over and then had to redesign it and whatnot. The long story short is the Su-27 was the high component of the high-low component of Su-27, MiG-29, and being kind of diametrically opposed to F-15 and F-16. The Su-27 was, in theory, designed to compete with and be better than what the Russians thought the F-15 was capable of. It was also designed to be, in theory, in practice, more maneuverable than it, at least according to the designers. And they did have a lot of emphasis on this idea of super maneuverability, this idea of maneuvering at very, very high angles of attack and being able to take advantage of that flight envelope. The other thing is, if you read what the designers say about it, they'll also say that they engineered the plane to have a lift coefficient of greater than 2 to 2.3. There's a couple sources that say that, and every fluid dynamics simulation, every modeling simulation I've seen has not shown a lift coefficient of 2. And speaking of lift and drag coefficients, we do have to talk a little bit about those too. And to make something complicated simple, a lift-drag diagram, coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag, basically is a dimensionless number that represents the efficiency of a wing, the efficiency in terms of lift and the efficiency in terms of drag, where basically as you increase angle of attack, the lift coefficient is going to increase until a certain point. The airflow separates, does la-di-da, stalls, and then the lift coefficient goes down where it's doing less lift. At the same time, as you increase your angle of attack, your drag will increase, and the same thing, your drag diagram is going to start a little bit gentle, and it's going to go up, and it's going to go off into la-di-da space. Now, the problem with the Su-27, and the problem with doing research on this and trying to use lift to drag diagrams to actually characterize this plane is I keep looking. I keep finding more fluid dynamics simulations. I keep finding more modeling testing. I keep finding more sources. And none of them agree with each other in the slightest bit. There is no nice, neat range of lift to drag coefficients where I can look at the game and at my current knowledge level go, aha, this is what they need to do, this is how they'd fix it, this is exactly what it's supposed to do. There's no way to do that right now. There's no way for me to do that with any sense of confidence. The other issue is when you look at the actual sources, when you look at the flight manual and when you look at the prototype manual and some of the graphs out of them, you have to take those graphics and then convert them to standards that we can understand. Because if you look at the turn rate diagram in the Su-27 manual, it's all done in G-force values. So instead of characterizing it as a turn rate in degrees per second, it's actually done as a G-loading, which means you have to take that G-loading and then take the airspeed and then do an equation on it to actually get the turn rate. But not only that, there's kind of some devils in the details there, because the manual is not done in true airspeed. It is done in indicated airspeed. So before you even do that, you have to take the indicated airspeed and convert it to true airspeed, because at 5,000 meters, 500 kph of indicated airspeed is actually going to be a lot faster than 500 kph. And I've done that, and I've done it a couple of times, and I've gotten good at it. I've got a process down where I can extrapolate stuff from graphs pretty quickly now and get a general idea. But holy hell, has it been a pain in the ass. And not only that, I've made the mistake before of assuming that it's been true airspeed and not indicated airspeed, and then I make a graph and I go, hey, look at this, and I compare it to other things that I know actually exist, and it's aha, the Su-27 is the best plane in the world. It does everything 3.5 degrees per second better at every single altitude than the Eurofighter. It's that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all with any of the other sources that I have. It doesn't make any sense with the Western sources. It doesn't even make sense with the other Russian sources that have the calculated turn rate of the T-10 prototype, or what the T-10 probably was supposed to do compared to what they thought the F-16 or the F-15 could do. And you look at it and go, fuck, this doesn't work at all. Doesn't make any damn sense. So you go back to the drawing board, but you make the graphic, you post it in your Discord, and some fucking dude who's going to cope about it immediately takes it to War Thunder forums and posts it and says, aha, this is this. And I'm like, even though you've been directly asked, like, okay, what's the deal with the flight model? And I'm like, I think the deal with the flight model and the deal with this graph is I have misinterpreted the flight model, and I need to check with someone to actually verify whether or not it's indicated or true airspeed. It turns out it's true airspeed, which means that the whole initial graph that I made like a year ago or a year and a half ago, that I looked at it and just kind of like didn't pass the stiff test. I'm like, that I said was bullshit, that immediately got posted on the forums by a guy who said, aha, yeah, imagine if it was this. That, yeah, it was bullshit. So where does that leave us today? Well, so first off, when it comes to understanding the Su-27, I like to stick to things that I can see, things that I know happened. This is why, while airshow footage and airshow performances are in large part propaganda, they're also just verifiable things that happened. Like, for instance, the video here starts with the Paris Airshow demonstration of a 13-second 360-degree turn, and this is something that definitely happened. You can watch unedited footage. There are multiple recordings of it that, yeah, it did a 360-degree turn in 13 seconds, roughly, give or take half a second, depending on where you want to start your stopwatch on it. But it's something that definitely did happen. Like, you could see it with your own eyes. That doesn't mean that you take the 360 degrees divided by 17 or divided by 13 and go, aha, this is the sustained turn rate. No, that turn was probably done with starting at a higher speed and then bleeding off to a lower speed, so that gives you an average turn of like 27 degrees per second over a 12-second period under some kind of weight loading, under some kind of clean configuration. So that doesn't mean that I think the most logical conclusion is, aha, the Su-27 will do a 13-second turn when loaded with 50% fuel. I think that's kind of unreasonable. I think it's fair to assume that airshow performances, the safety margins, the fact that you know the weather, the fact that you're performing over a runway means that the plane is likely loaded very light on fuel, probably just enough to really do the performance, maybe a little bit of a reserve in it. You could maybe make the argument that, oh, they took the radar out and they made a specially modified airframe just for airshow performances and changed the G limits and stuff to make the airshow more impressive. But I mean, I don't necessarily think that's the case, because the Su-27 airshow performances, I think people get lost in the sauce about like what the actual kind of propaganda value for that is. And the propaganda value for it is it's an engineering statement. It's a mechanical engineering statement of basically like, hey, we took this gigantic plane that doesn't have thrust vectoring, that is our long-range strategic fighter to patrol all of this Russian airspace, because the Su-27 is, in a lot of ways, just a gigantic flying fuel tank, and we made it very nimble. Not just nimble for its size, but it can control itself through a whole entire extended flight regime beyond the capabilities of what basically most modern Western aircraft are capable of, minus the F-22. Also, the Su-27 is probably the very last of the true fourth-generation fighters, where flight performance was prioritized over things like infrared signature reduction, things like radar signature reduction, things like the electronic part of it was not necessarily unimportant to it, because the Su-27 was also supposed to have a pretty good radar when it came out, but that radar program basically didn't pay off, and they had to kind of come up with the mechanical radar that they kind of threw into the thing as kind of a little bit of a holdover for, I don't know, like a good, well, the collapse of the Soviet Union made it like a good 30 years, but the mechanical aspect of it is very impressive. The fly-by-wire aspect, even though their fly-by-wire system is less complex, less computer-intensive than something like the F-16 or other Western fighters, the fact that the plane is mechanically engineered to be able to do the things that you see it do is genuinely impressive. However, that doesn't mean that I think that the Su-27 in 1992 is like this world-beating fighter where it's better than everything else, and like Russia could have definitely like won every war that it fought, and they've only They've only ever made good stuff. Like, now the plane had its own problems, and most of those are internal. Most of those are related to the electronic part, the user interface part of it. But the mechanical part of it, the airframe part of it, it's still pretty cool. Like we can be honest here. We can be like, hey, you know what? When the plane like pulls 90 degrees and goes up, and we be like, oh, well, that's useless in combat. Well, yeah, but it looks cool. Who cares? Sarcasm aside, super maneuverability is not useless. It's just something that is not immediately necessary, and it is something that has become less and less necessary as time has progressed. It is important to understand the historical context that the Su-27 exists in, of that early 1990s time frame, where there's two schools of thought going on. One is this idea of active radar missiles and beyond visual range combat with networked radars, and where the entire combat is going to be happening basically over the horizon of two parties firing missiles at each other, and close combat's not going to happen. At the same time, every major power is dealing with the ghost of the Vietnam War. They're dealing with the practical aspects of the Iraq War, with the fact that at the time, the idea that within visual range fights, close range fights, dog fights could still happen and were still likely to happen, just based on gaps in radar coverage, the fact the equipment's not that good, the fact that active radar missiles and even semi-active radar missiles at the time are not as good in practice as they are on paper. The actual readiness rate and the actual kind of hit rate for missiles, especially depending on how they're maintained, was not as great as it is today. So this idea that two planes could meet up and they're going to get into a dogfight was something that was definitely planned for. And super maneuverability was one of those aspects that was explored, not just by the Russians, but also by Western powers. The F-18 and the F-16 both had versions of the plane tested with thrust vectoring, just to test those flight envelopes and to test how applicable those would be and whether or not it would be a worthwhile investment for a combat airplane. The same thing goes for the Europeans with the Eurofighter 2000. They looked at and developed a thrust vectoring nozzle for it because they considered it at one time to be something that was desirable to have, and that the increased maintenance cost was something that they were willing to take. So what happened with all these planes, though? Well, the answer is the missile technology caught up. Basically, dogfighting doesn't really matter if me and you, we're going to go into a merge. It doesn't matter what kind of turn we do, where we look at each other 90 degrees across a circle with an HMD, we shoot a missile and it goes across and we both kill each other right away. Where this idea of being able to pirouette at low speeds and being able to tilt the nose to just the right direction to have the correct exit for the HMD missile shot, it got to a point where the exercises, the simulations and whatnot, were basically both sides beating each other's faces against a wall and going, well, if both of our planes meet up in the sky like this, we're all just going to probably die. So the other thing that happened is the radar missiles and the radars got better, and that doctrine as well kind of evolved too. Where the Eurofighter, where if you look at the Eurofighter development, that thing is primarily designed as a high-speed BVR missile platform, where it's supposed to have good turning performance. But the reason it has good turning performance and the reason that its supersonic turning performance is optimized is so that it can go to 50,000 feet, shoot an AMRAAM, and just lob that bitch as far as it can go, and then turn around and turn left or turn right and not lose a bunch of speed and escape the counter-launch missiles. Because at the same time, in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, everyone's missiles basically probably more or less had the same kinds of performance values, where the difference between an R-77 and an AIM-120 in maximum range was not great enough to justify equipping them on a subpar like Mach 1.2 airplane versus a Mach 2.2, 2.5, 2. Whatever the hell the F-22 does. In fact, super maneuverability was desirable enough that Boeing included it on the F-22. Now, as time has gone on our new 6th generation fighters, on anything that we see today, probably not going to be super maneuverable. It doesn't mean thrust vectoring is going away. There are other reasons to have thrust vectoring, but as things have transitioned more towards stealth and towards low observability and networking and being a gigantic meshed computer system and not dying in dogfights, super maneuverability doesn't really matter that much today. That doesn't mean that the Su-27 has gone away, though. The Su-27 is still around. They have still gone and kept upgrading it, and the reason they keep upgrading it is because the plane is huge. The plane is big, it's proven, and it's a good platform for attaching a bunch of stuff to still shoot it really far away. You can put a lot of really long-range missiles on an Su-27 as the radars get bigger, as the radars get better. Even though Russian radars are not as efficient as the Western counterparts, the nose cone in the Su-27 is really, really large, so they can make a less efficient radar, jam it in there, and it will, in some performance metrics, be on par with some Western counterparts. That's vaguely true. Not going to say specifically, like, yes, because I'm not a radar guy, but with the way radars work, there is a certain point where you just keep scaling them up. If you just make a really big radar, there's just a certain point it's just big. And the fact that it's big means that it works even if it's not efficient. Anyways, that's my tangent. That's my short, abbreviated history on the Su-27. Now let's get into the madness of what we have in the game. What Gaijin has done is they have altered their coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag values for the Su-27 and the rest of the flanker flight model family. So that includes the Su-30, Su-30 SM2, Su-33, all of that other stuff. They've done this because of a bug report where someone took the dive recovery numbers that are in the manual and pointed out that the plane was not performing a high enough G-turn in a specific condition. I think the specific condition is something like power off or power idle, 500 kph, 24 degrees angle of attack, near sea level, and it's supposed to reach 7 or 8 Gs or whatever. And previously, the previous patch was reaching, say for instance, 6.5 or 6.5 in localhost, which, by the way, I have learned something because I tried to buff the F-15C, and I used the localhost NY values for that bug report. And guess what? The NY values that are listed in the game are taken in a wrong frame of reference, so they also have to be converted. So in calculating turn rate, the only correct way to do it is actually just do a 360-degree turn, look at the heading, and then just divide the heading by the time and do it that way. Because if you just do it with the NY value, take the G-force value, which is NY, and plug it into a turn rate calculation, it will give you an erroneous value, and that erroneous value will be greater at greater angles of attack. And that is why on my testing for the MiG-29, when I use WTRTI, which WTRTI is doing the exact same thing, taking NY values, pushing it through a turn rate equation with the true airspeed and giving you an output, that's why the MiG-29 on paper was underperforming. In reality, it probably does match its sustained turn rate values. Now, speaking of sustained turn rate values, I did extrapolate the Su-27 turn rate values, and I have a whole spreadsheet for this, so I can do it at 1,000 meters, 5,000 meters, all of the different altitudes. And before the patch, the Su-27 was overperforming in terms of sustained turn rate by around 1 degree to 1.5 degrees per second. Basically on the margins of, are the devs going to act on it if someone reports it? Probably not, and actually getting a real turn rate value that isn't from StatShark is going to be very difficult. StatShark, by the way, for the Su-27 is accurate to within about a half a degree, maybe up to 3/4 of a degree, depending on the speed. However, the part where it gets bad, and one of the artifacts from the previous flight model, is that they've kind of taken the T-50 calculations and the Su-27 manual and kind of like mix and match them together, where the turn rate on the Su-27 at higher speeds, at higher indicated airspeeds, just gets completely off the charts. And the Su-27 isn't the only plane that does this, but it does it to a very, very noticeable degree. The other thing that has happened with the new implementation is the low-speed sustained turn rate is also higher than it should be. But more importantly, the thing that actually makes the most substantial difference is not really the turn rates. Bumping the sustained turn rate up by half a degree or down by half a degree, it doesn't really matter. The fact that they changed the lift and drag coefficient means that the plane basically holds double the energy that it used to. Its bleed rate values are phenomenally better. Across the board, the flight model went from being one of probably the worst in the game, just ahead of the MiG-29. It was bad but usable, to we are into nearly certified baby plane territory. And the reason I say that is the Su-27 right now, the way that it performs is basically superior to the F-16C, the F-16 Block 15, the F-16A Block 10, the F-15A, basically anything that's American. It's by somewhat small margins. I'd call them medium margins. And the fact that you are able to retain a bunch of speed at high speed or do like a 14G turn immediately right off the rip is one of the big things. I think that what they've done with this flight model, and I spoke to the Russian guys that made the bug report, by the way, because I correspond with them and I actually talked to people, and their intent was not exactly this. And their conclusion and what they believe about the flight model and the plane in real life is very similar to what I believe or what I have kind of pieced together, where the plane is supposed to be pretty okay at rate fighting, but it's not quite as good as F-15A, F-16A, where it should lose the rate fight, and it probably should be about on par with an F-18 in an angular fight into like nose position stuff with like a little bit of nuance to it, where maybe in some cases the 27 will be better, in some cases the 18 will be better, depending on fuel load, power to weight ratio, yada, 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 where right now the plane just kind of does the F-18 thing better by a pretty significant margin, and it does the F-16 thing basically as well or probably a little bit better than the F-16, which is a balancing decision for the Su-27 SM and S that none of us that are flanker fans, quote unquote, are really happy with. It makes a lot of the matchups that were kind of not close for the American side, now they're just not close for the Russian side, unless you're fighting against something like a Gripen, Eurofighter, Rafale, whatnot. Now, is this actually super relevant to gameplay for most of you guys, for people that play Sim? No, right now the Sim meta is fly straight, shoot 18 missiles at each other, shoot the other guy's missiles down, shoot with the last missile, maybe you merge, maybe it lasts more than a turn and a half, and then you get blown up by another guy shooting all 17 of his AMRAAMs at you. Like, that's the reality of it. The more practical result in regards to greater gameplay is going to be that you can enter and exit notches a lot more quickly and more efficiently with a lot less energy loss. This is especially important for planes like the Su-30 and the Su-30 SM2 that are a lot heavier than the base model flanker and had consequently much worse bleed rates. Now, in regards to the way these matchups work, though, I've done quite a few F-16, F-18, and a bunch of different asymmetrical matchups against the new Su-27 flight model. And the really big difference now is the Su-27 is able to compete at that 850 kph rate range, which it always was competitive there. It was always pretty good at high speed rate, but now it can transition between high speed and low speed. Previously, you could either be high speed or you could be low speed, and once you got to low speed, you were, in a lot of ways, really, really stuck there, where you had to be really, really certain of when to pull, and you had to really abuse that energy retention between 1,000 down to 850, maybe time your pulls 1,000 down to 850, back up to 1,000 down to 850, where you're just doing this gigantic, basically Mach 1 loop and waiting for the other guy to make a mistake. Now the Su-27 flight model has enough ability to fight at every single speed range that it has the ability to force other people to make mistakes. It is basically, for all intents and purposes, on par with to superior to the F-16A Block 10. In fact, the best way that I found fighting a lot of Su-27s, at least for the people that are used to the flight model, that are used to the old one, is forcing an angular fight, trying to force it into a scissors where you cut across each other's nose and then I can get into a counterattack position. Previously, though, like this position right here with his wingtip vortices, with me kind of solidly behind him previously, that was basically guaranteed that you'd be able to easily outrate him at this point. Now that's no longer the case. Due to that increased lift coefficient, he's able to pick up speed better. He's able to take that high speed, go to medium speed, and respond to positions that you have. And this is pretty much true for every plane in the game that is the Gripen or worse. The Rafale, the Eurofighter are still a little bit better, and I think there's not really a lot of excuses for losing in them. But even then, the Su-27 still has a rate that is on par with the Eurofighter at very high speed, and then it loses at medium speed, and it loses a little bit to the Eurofighter at low speed, but not really enough to matter. Right now, what it can do is it can keep pointing its nose up, especially on lower fuel loads, where it's kind of the best of both worlds between an F-16 and an F-18. It's not almost the best of both worlds, or just very, very close. I think the margins for this fight have moved far enough that the Su-27 is basically sitting into kind of baby plane territory, where it is kind of where we went from it being too bad on one day to now it's really into that aspect of like, I'm not really buying this. I don't really think that this is realistic. I don't think that this is necessarily a good dynamic in regards to the matchup as well. And with the F-16 has a little bit of this, but the F-16, at least when you compare it to its EM diagram, largely matches it even at these kind of higher speeds. I think, in fact, if I recall correctly, it actually underperforms just a little bit in bleed rate at high speeds, and then it overperforms at low speeds. So you have this matchup now where what Gaijin has done is they've really kind of leaned into this idea that the Su-27 is this like superior rate fighter at very high speeds, but also just superior at low speeds. And what this means for American planes is that, like, at least in kind of dogfights, if you're not F-16A Block 10, F-15A on a good day, F-15C, kind of like dead on arrival, at least against a normal 27. Any of the lighter flankers are going to go to town on it, and there's nothing really to fix about this unless Gaijin goes back and takes another stab at the flight model, or if they try to figure out like what values are they going to use for the high-speed turn. Are they going to use the T50 values for high-speed turn rate that are higher than the manual values, or what are they going to do? And the answer is they're probably not going to do anything, because consequently it's pretty easy to sell some Su-30 premiums right now, because now they're legitimately okay, even though they're technically heavier, shittier flankers with better or worse avionics depending on the model. But that is what it is. At the same time, I'm griping about the inaccuracy of the Su-27, but the F-16 and every other fighter has other aspects that makes them inaccurate. Like the F-16 should not be this competitive at low speeds and high angles of attack, because at low speeds and high angles of attack, the plane will eventually go into a deep stall. It should not have an angle of attack limit of over 30 degrees. It should be stuck to 25, and it should really be there. If it was, and everything else is correct, you'd have like something of a dynamic matchup, but the F-16 would be kind of forced to really play into the rate fighting aspect. Now, I'm not the best F-16 player in the game. I did do the opposite side of the matchmaker with this guy, and the results were basically very similar. Block 15 was less competitive. Block 10 was almost even, but with the 27, if I just kept my speed and kept going behind him, and I could either maintain equal position, I could transition down, I could do everything that I want to do out of a flight model, and then you just run out of fuel, because the Su-27 on 30% fuel has basically a longer burn time than the F-16 on min fuel. Same thing though, F-18 used to be very much superior to the Su-27 in kind of a low-speed fight, where the 27, once it got slow, you kind of flew around behind its nose a couple of times, and then you just kind of got a free win. Now that is no longer the case. In fact, this is one of the things, though, I think the F-18 should be a little bit better than the Su-27, at least in this regard, in these kinds of, like, extremely kind of medium-high AOA fights, where, yeah, it has the Cobra button, but this level of maneuverability, maybe the transitions should be okay, but the actual kind of looking at it on paper, the turn rate values that are present in the manual versus what the 27 is getting in game are basically separated by about 2.5 to 3 degrees per second, where meeting that one data point has thrown other things off, and has thrown it off far enough in one direction where I'm going to say, hey, yeah, this is kind of it's kind of shitty to be on the team realism part, but then see, oh yeah, my favorite plane got buffed, so now the game is a huge revenge fantasy against players from 2 years ago that were abusing American flight models and telling everyone to suck it up, that Russian flight models were just bad IRL, so getting blown up in 2 turns is perfectly acceptable. And finally, now it's Russia's turn to dominate. Yes, finally. And that's all well and good, but it's a shitty way to play the game, and it's a shitty way to bring new people into the game, because while a lot of people look at this as a revenge fantasy against the blue side, if you actually paid attention to the names, and I pay attention to the names, I read the names, I have the TISM, most of the guys that were playing blue side 2 years ago don't play the game anymore, or they play red side now. Let me put it this way. The very first plane that I ground out for the new patch was the new British Eurofighter with the ASA radar, and the reason I did that is because if you read the forums and you follow a guy named Morvrin, who's always posting about how British stuff is awful and suffers, and if you've paid attention to his complaints about the Eurofighter for the past year and 3 months, it's always been about the radar. It's always been the radar's useless. If we just had the Captor E, if we just had an ASA radar, the plane would be good. It'd be dominating. It'd be great. And that dude played 2 games with it, couldn't bomb in sim, and that dude is not going to touch that plane until they add ASRAM, meteors, and turn the plane into literally point-and-click adventure where you click a button and a fucking laser shoots out and blows up the enemy plane. And that guy's not the only one. There's plenty of other people that if you went back a year and a half ago, when F-16C, F-15C were the best things, 2/3 of their games would be blue side, maybe 1/3 would be red side. Dude named fucking Mythic Pie made some post on like the War Thunder Sim Reddit about how red side players are just losing because they have small hearts and tiny hands and can't deal with any kind of opposition, and their planes are technically better, yada 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 yada. That dude hasn't touched sim for like 8 months. He's not here anymore. He's gone. He's out of the picture. The last time he played sim, I blew him up with the British Eurofighter while he was in the Su-30. As soon as the meta changed, the player habits change, where this idea that we're gonna get revenge finally because now we have the broken flight model. Like, no, you're not getting revenge. You're just punching down. The only people that you're really going to be shooting against are going to be people that don't know any damn better. And it's gotten so bad recently that the quote-unquote red side super squad, the core group of guys that were the sweaty tryhards of PvP back in Su-27 SM with the dogshit radar that double scanned versus the hordes of blues, a lot of us are playing blue side now because with the Su-30 SM2, that is a pretty respectable meta shift. The fact the F-15C, the F-15C Golden Eagle, those planes just aren't as good as the current top crop of planes. And the player perception right now is that the Su-30 SM2 is the ooga booga mean monster of a plane that is impossible to counter. In fact, It kind of is, but it isn't. It's still an SU-30. Even with the buff flight model, what the buff flight model does is it moves the bleed rates to be on par with F-15C, because the SU-30 is a heavy as fuck plane, and weight is a huge penalty to bleed rates, that now it's competitive at high altitude, and the thrust vectoring is no longer a complete gimmick where you just like fall out of the sky. Now you put your nose up, fall out of the sky, then maybe do it again, and then fall out of the sky. Where in EC games, I'm not too worried about SU-30 players in regards to they're going to force a merge with me and then I can do nothing. Same thing with everything else. But when it comes down to the 1v1 and the lighter flankers compete, and they compete very well, and they compete in kind of all the fantasy bullshit aspects that the Eurofighter, the Gripen, the Rafale, where all this shit is basically at this point just kind of made up and really, really fudged together. And it doesn't really help that the way that we play the game, the way that we play these fights, has evolved over time, where something like using manual controls and trim to exceed the G limits and sit at very high speed was something that was not as normal 2 years ago as it is today. The awareness of rate fighting and being able to abuse that like high speed kind of compression zone where you can rate better than your sustained rate wasn't necessarily something that a lot of people were hyper aware of 2 years ago, or were specifically trying to play for. There was a couple of guys that did that. Shezerate was one of them, and there got to a point where like I got sick and tired of fighting the guy because it was the same fucking thing every time, where you're just kind of doing loops, and if you got the inside loop, it's just going to go on forever. It's going to get to 30 seconds of fuel, and you're both going to pull in for the head-on, and then whoever aims better wins. And that is kind of like the nature of what that is. But because I have kind of stepped aside and been playing props and playing other things, and a lot of other people are learning that kind of style, that is in a lot of ways like what the 1v1 part of it is coming down to. And that is also part of it too, is playing with min fuel, playing on basically vapors, where these are a good indication of what the flight model is capable of, but it's not a good indication of exactly what's going to happen in an EC game. You get fights like this in an EC game, and both of you guys are going to die like 3 times over. Like, it's just not going to work out. That's why in EC, when I actually dogfight, I try to win as fast as possible, which means I'm going to go a little bit slower in the first turn, get behind the guy, and then try to ride his ass and shoot him down very quickly. And if a guy's going to do this kind of thing, like doing like a rate thing, like a big loop thing, if I have a thrust vectoring missile, especially a Mica or something, going like across the circle and then just coming back high off bore sighting, one in the head on, and then just flying the fuck away, that's like probably the most viable dogfighting tactic for EC. But regardless, what we have right now with the Su-27 is better than it used to be. If this flight model had dropped 2 years ago with the F-16C, people would have thought that it was overpowered, and it would have been. But also, not only do we have the flight model of the Su-27 now, we have all of the other kind of bullshit little buffs they added to it too, like the increased sustained turn rate, where they just kind of like moved it up for whatever reason, and the double R-77 pylon that I guess it never had. So right now, the game really is kind of a mess in terms of realism. You have a bunch of planes that overperform at high speeds, that retain too much speed in a turn at high speeds, especially beyond Mach. You have planes that get to Mach and then accelerate way too fast beyond Mach. Looking at you, Mr. Rafale. You have a bunch of planes that don't have any advisable AOA limit. The F-16 was the first egregious example, but the Eurofighter has since then kind of blown that out of the water. And all of the Eurofighters, all of the Gripens, and the Rafales, all of those flight models are all descended from the original Gripen flight model, which in and of itself, when you compare it to its own metrics that you can actually find is overperforming pretty much across the board, where everything in game, especially on manual controls, behaves as if it has a good bit of thrust vectoring, maybe not the full aspect of it, where you get into high angles of attack and then you're able to kind of steer the plane around with the rudder, where that's a really indicative part in the slow speed fight, where if you're looking for realistic dogfights, War Thunder has a good bit of it. There's a lot of visual cues, there's a lot of technique here that's reasonable, but the actual performance that we're getting and the speeds that we do it at, the way that we do it, has some parallels, but in reality, it's all fake and make-believe. And I don't mean to sound too frustrated, but I think the largest source of my frustration isn't necessarily that things are different or that they changed things or that they waited 2.5 years to change things, but rather just the overall inconsistency across the board. Just the fact that you can submit a bug report with the SU-27 SK flight manual, and if you don't roll the right tech mod at the right time, they will come back and tell you that the SU-27 SK flight manual is not a valid source to bug report the SU-27. This is something that has happened multiple times to multiple people. At the same time, they'll tell you, hey, you can't use HUD footage to file a bug report. That's not a source. And then on a different day of the week for a different plane, like the Rafale, they will take the HUD footage and some kind of tertiary source that just vaguely says 23 degrees per second, and then just index the whole entire plane based on the HUD footage and based on the bleed rates that they can see and derive from the HUD footage. Same thing goes for using the video of the air show performance, just demonstrating the 13-second turn and showing that the video has audio that is added by Sukhoi talking about the airplane, and they say no, videos are not a valid source for a bug report, which is very, very silly. And we finally get to this where the initial goal was to make the SU-27 a little bit more competitive at low speed, and instead we got something that is over competitive at high speeds, something that is maybe a little bit over competitive at low speeds in a way that doesn't match the manual values, and in a way that the way that it was pushed out is probably the thing that gets to me. The way that it was rushed out, where it made it to the live server with something like a 25 degree per second turn rate at high speeds, where nothing could beat it. That was what my original post on my channel was talking about, where yeah, they did come back and tune it down a little bit, but I just don't think they're going to come back to it again, because all of the planes that we have in the game, all of the next generation flankers that we are getting are probably going to be heavier. The SU-35, that thing has a 19,000 kilogram empty weight. Its empty weight is basically 1 ton short of the 50% fuel weight of the SU-27, the 50% normal fuel weight of the SU-27. That thing is heavy. That means that thing is probably not going to perform all that well. At the same time, we're right on the cusp of adding stealth fighters. And guess what? It's going to be more made up, more fake. Welcome to the Year of the Flanker. That's a Beer Thunder. I'm going to bed.